Now, during the peace negotiations, the settlers throughout the West Bank realized that for the first time it's actually a possibility that they would be evicted, that their settlement would actually be left out. So they understood that they need to also take actions in order to mark the border in a way that would leave their settlement inside Israel. So what they started doing was that they left the settlements and took over the hilltops around the settlement to create new clusters of settlements, new settlement blocks that would block any future evictions. The difference was that for the first time this establishment of new settlements, of new outposts, was not being planned by the government. It was the settlers themselves that got out of settlements like the one that we see now on the left. This is Ma'on. They went outside Ma'on, and for example, where you see these antennas on the left, that's Ma'on Farm. That's another settlement. People from Ma'on just went outside, took over the hilltop next to Ma'on, and all of a sudden you have a new settlement. Now, obviously the effect of this on the lives of Palestinians was even worse, because this time nobody was even trying to check if the land was being privately owned by Palestinians. In a lot of the cases, the hilltops that they took over was being owned or being used by Palestinians here. It's grazing land, it's farming land. The Palestinian roads that connect the towns, that lead to schools, in a lot of the occasions were crossing either where the new settlement was established or right next to it. And now when the new settlement was established, they couldn't reach this hilltop. And not only that, in a lot of the occasions they couldn't even walk next to it, because around every settlement there is a buffer zone that Palestinians are not allowed to enter. So the effect on the lives of the Palestinians was obviously disastrous. Now the third thing that started happening at the same time as the peace negotiations is that for the first time, again 22 years after it was declared, the government decided that it needs to actually implement its decision of not allowing civilians to live inside this firing zone. Under the government of Rabin and afterwards Barak, and again in parallel to the peace negotiations, for the first time the Israeli Civil Administration Office, which is the Security of Defense's Ministry of Civilian Control, basically it's the military government, government you could call it. For the first time they were going inside these villages in the firing zone and started demolishing the houses there and evicting the Palestinians, saying that civilians are not allowed to live inside practicing firing zones. Actually throughout the 90s, it started in 92 and was happening non-stop until 2001, that every now and then the Civil Administration Office would come inside with bulldozers, tearing down tents and houses and caves and evicting the people that were living there. Now, the people that live in this area, in this firing zone, are very unique communities. They're called the cave dwellers. It's been documented at least since the 19th century. This unique way of life, these unique communities. It's Palestinians that live in a very traditional manner. They mostly live in caves, either natural caves or man-made caves, in very small communities, not connected to electricity. They sustain themselves mostly on their on their sheep. They're mostly shepherds. And throughout the last, decades or even centuries, they were traditionally, grazing the land and then selling their dairy products to the urban towns like Yatta or Samoa. So in many ways, these very small, very traditional communities were the most vulnerable to any kind of aggression. So when the military started coming in the 90s, telling them, you're living inside a practicing zone, there was basically nothing that they could have done to resist it. I mean, in the legal way, I mean. And there was something like 7 evictions between 92 and 2001. And that was the story here throughout the 1990s. Now, in September 2000, the second Intifada started. I don't know how much you guys know about this, but the term Intifada refers to the uprisings, the Palestinian uprisings. The first one was between 88 and 94. And that was mostly a popular uprising, mostly demonstrations and riots and stone throwing. And it ended with the opening of the peace negotiations and the establishment of the Palestinian Authority. The second Intifada, that started in 2000 and continued until 2005, was different in nature than the first one. It also had the popular sides to it. I mean, there were demonstrations and riots, but it also had a more militant side to it. Shootings and attacks and suicide bombings. And here, this area of South Hebron Hills, even though, like I mentioned before, was in comparison to other areas of the West Bank was relatively quiet, even here there were drive-by shootings and infiltrations into settlements and attacks. And obviously, respectively, the aggressions on the Israeli side grew respectively. First of all, from the side of the settlers, I mean, attacks conducted by settlers, especially from those outposts, against the neighboring communities were also growing and reached a peak actually in the end of 2002 when settlers here murdered a Palestinian 17-year-old girl next to Hebron. But again, this wasn't the first time actually settler attacks that resulted with the killing of Palestinians were taking place here since the early 90s. One of the most famous examples was Mahmoud Abu Safha, that was murdered by a settler called Yoram Shkolnik. I mean, when we'll visit the village of Palestinian Susia, we'll hear more about it from Nasser Nawadja, our Palestinian partner there. So I don't want to go into too much detail into this now. But also in the activity of the military here. The military incursion grew. Actually, during the peak years of the Intifada, the Palestinian Authority was basically dismantled. I mean, when I was serving here, we were going inside Yatta and other towns that were at least theoretically Area A all the time on a daily basis. We were told that if we see, an armed Palestinian, we immediately shoot to kill. There was no such thing as a Palestinian policeman, at least not armed. Now I'm going to stop for a second. We're now crossing into